So I want to talk about what the Soviet Union does, what Germany does, and then how the United States responds to it. So this slide has a lot of very specific dates. You notice a key date here is in 1936, and so I'm going to put this across the board here, and we can see that this is a key date. 33 is our key date at the start. 36 is a key date. I'm also going to put here 39, because that's when the war is going to start. And then lastly, I'm going to put a key date here, which is 41, because as you guys remember, this is when the United States enters it. And so we have kind of the beginning of a matrix. We have the West and the United States, but remember, the United States is separate from what's going on with England and France. We have the East, Italy, Germany, Japan, Soviet Union. They're all separate countries, so we can't group them up. But they are combined in the sense that they all are following this general ideology that is on the opposite side of the Western ideology. Rule of law, rule by might. From 1933 to 1936, we don't have a lot of foreign policy issues coming to the fore because most of the focus is on domestic. There are some exceptions. Do you remember the exceptions that I'm thinking about? Not a lot of foreign policy. You don't have to you don't have to know it, but I'm just wondering.
Neutrality Act, 1955.
Close, we're getting there. That's why 36 is this like barrier line. There are some events that are beginning to happen that aren't necessarily domestic policy. I'll let you know, and I don't have much space here. So all I'm going to say is if you remember, Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. And as far as the Far East is concerned, that's really the start of World War II. From that point, Japan will be almost continually at war in one form or another. It won't be massive, it won't be worldwide. This is Japan versus northern China, Manchuria. China will be fighting nonstop pretty much from 1931 to 1945. There'll be more or less violent years, and by the time you get to 39, it's full war. But it's starting in the beginning. The United States isn't paying attention to this. Most of the West isn't paying attention to this. Japan was a member of the League of Nations. The League of Nations responded to Japanese invasion of Manchuria by saying you shouldn't do this, and Japanese said, I guess we're not going to be part of the League of Nations. That was it. So you can see clearly on the opposite side of the mentality. This is part of the reason why they're on the rule of might. They're not supportive of the rule of law. So this is kind of a hint of what's going to go on. We also remember that Mussolini, he gets in power in the 20s. Italy invades North Africa in 1935. And it doesn't really affect the Americans. Italy isn't a huge country, although Mussolini is a very kind of larger than life. We saw a picture of him, I'll show you. This picture isn't an accident. Like, we didn't get him on a bad day. This really is what he looks like most of the time because that's what he wanted to look like. He deliberately, Mussolini deliberately took on the image of El Duce, the Duke. He's in a military outfit. I don't know if you want to say he's a thug, but he kind of wants to look like a thug. The reason is that he represents order. And so the Italians are responding to that. They want him to be strong. One of the ways that, if you want to characterize Mussolini, he doesn't create systematic concentration camps like Hitler does during World War II, but he's still a thug. Italy, if you know popular culture, Italy has a problem with mafioso. The mob all came from Sicily, came to the United States. Well, it really is true, actually. The southern parts of Italy, the national government had a weak hold over it, and so organized crime was kind of rampant, not only in Sicily, but in the southern Italy and throughout the coast. So what he does is he restores order. He comes into his town with his brown shirts, guys, his thugs, they're all in the same basic outfits, but they're like military, and they're in discipline. And he comes marching in. This is before he's leader. He's gaining authority, he's becoming leader. He comes into a town, he says, who's your godfather? Who's the local mob boss? And they point to some villa on the hill. And so they go over to the villa, they pull the mob boss out, and they beat him to death right in front of everybody. And then they move on. Okay, order is solved. That mob boss will no longer terrorize you. He's promising order. So as he goes through parts of Italy and systematically removing the crime, removing the disorder that happens when you don't have a strong government, he is restoring order, eliminating the mobsters, and becoming this big, powerful guy. And that's what the Italians are wanting in the 20s. So this image isn't accidental. He wants to be the guy who is the symbol of order. He is what Germany is looking to as an example. Even though Italy is half the size of Germany in terms of its strength, its population, its military power, it is the example that Hitler is going to look to. Because throughout the same 1920s, the German economy is in shambles. We don't have organized crime running around, but we have disorder. The government isn't able to pass laws effectively. They're trying to be a democracy. But a democracy in a country that is not trained for democracy can be very difficult because people just fight with each other. You don't have organized parties, you don't have organized consensus, and so it's within this disorder that Hitler says, well, Mussolini solved it in that way, I'm also going to be a strong guy. And so you can look, he comes up with the same outfit. He has the same basic sense of not necessarily a thug, but order. I'm going to have order. So when he goes through towns, he doesn't have the brown shirts, he'll have these guys in black uniforms. Same thing. They're kind of restoring order, not against organized crime, but against the sense of Germans' loss of identity. And he's going to promise to restore this identity. You can see where this is on the opposite side. The reason why I mentioned 33 to 36 is that in 33, Germany is weak and disordered. But by the time we get to 36, Germany is suddenly this vast military power. That is 3 years. 3 years. So we have to ask, how did we get that transition? So we go back one more step and we start looking at some of the dates. And I want to talk about what Germany is doing and then what the US and Europe is doing in reaction. So we'll start off, and we still have the smartboard as your primary picture. This is a small one, you may not see it directly, but I'm just going to verbally tell you about it. From 33 to 36, Hitler gets elected, and immediately he starts rebuilding the military. Now, at the time, even though this is a direct violation of the rule saying you must not have a military except for your police. This was the Treaty of Versailles. It's a direct violation. Most of the European nations turned a blind eye to it. They looked the other way for a couple of reasons. The first, you could say, well, what are they going to do about it? They're going to invade Germany? In 1933 and 34, they could have invaded Germany. Germany was not that powerful. Not at that time. They were still fragmented. They were still under disorder. Hitler was asserting himself. But it wasn't so much an inability to stop Germany as much as it was kind of a reflection of their rule of law. Why should they stop Germany? Every country has a right to be independent, has a right to be sovereign, which means they all have a right to have their own military. He's not saying he's going to take over the world. This is 34, 35. Remember, he isn't saying he's going to take over the world. He says we have a right to have the basic dignity that any other nation should have. And so we are going to violate the Treaty of Versailles. He doesn't say that, but England and France all recognize that that's what he's doing. And they do nothing about it. What does the United States do? Well, in 34 and 35, what are we preoccupied with? Great Depression, right? This is not on our radar. We are vaguely aware of it, but it's not something that we're paying attention to. Then we see change becoming in 35. 35 is when Italy invades North Africa. The United States does respond with a embargo act. But you have to put this in perspective. In 1935, really, the only countries that are at war is Italy taking over North Africa and Japan, who's still fighting in the Asia. And the Embargo Act says we will not trade with countries at war. That is the American response. Part of this is because there are some people, remember 1935 is in the midst of the Depression, there are some people that honestly believe that the reason why we had this Depression in 1933 was that we got sucked into World War I. That the only people who benefited from World War I were munitions makers, people who made weapons, that they were actually pushing the United States into the war so that they could sell more weapons, sell more bullets, sell more tanks. Now, this was a crazy thought. It wasn't real, but it was strong enough within the popular mindset that they actually had a House hearing that lasted for a couple of years, the Nye Commission, to investigate the munitions industry following World War I. Now, he didn't discover anything. And the reason why he didn't discover anything is that during the war, munitions manufacturers were prohibited from having any profit. So that can't have been the reason why we got into the war. Nevertheless, you know, there's the difference between what our reality is and what perception is. And there were a lot of people that thought this depression is because we got sucked into the war. So not only are they kind of blaming the West, but they're blaming the American leaders that allowed us to get involved. And so in 1935, you are having this expression. It's a popular expression of people saying we're not going to be sucked in again. The thing is, you got to take this with a grain of salt. This is in 1935. There is no major fear or conflict that we're worried about. This is even kind of a little bit before the Spanish Civil War. That's Franco we talked about last class in Spain, who is having his own little civil war and everybody's watching it. It doesn't go outside the Spanish borders. Italy is the only one that's having an attack in North Africa, but Libya is not a major threat. This isn't a huge conflict. We're not talking about the best of military technologies here. Japan is attacking in northern China, but it's on the other side of the world. So the point is that the Embargo Act is much more symbolic than it is actual. It's not affecting our trade. It's not really affecting our stance on what's happening with this rule of mind. And so in 35, we're just giving a symbolic act. We're still far more concerned about the Great Depression. 35 is when we start doing the second New Deal measures. This is when we're more concerned about how to affect local economies. 1936 is when a change begins. And this is when Germany is now strong enough militarily that it moves in to the Rhineland. And the Rhineland, I don't have a map up here. Do I have a map up here? Yes. Basically, the Rhineland is this territory between Germany and France. That's all you have to know about it. It is also the territory that Germany was explicitly forbidden to go into as part of the Treaty of Versailles. So this is number 2 violation of the Treaty of Versailles. They move into the Rhineland where they're not supposed to go. The Europe, the League of Nations, the French, the Belgium, the English, they're unhappy about this, but they are kind of have a new appreciation for the rule of law. So their initial response isn't to threaten them militarily. Their initial response is to call them to the table and say, you shouldn't do this. And Germany's response is, well, why not? The Rhineland is in German territory. Why should we be prohibited from having not only our people, but military in our own territory? You are treating us like a pariah. Hitler is using a lot of the same language that not the United States, but that the source of criticism that the United States had against the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. Hitler's taking advantage of that sentiment, which is part of this rule of law sentiment. And he says every country should have basic dignities. Every country should have basic rights. And you unfairly deprived us of these rights after World War I. So as we become and try to establish our identity, you should let go of those laws. And Europe said, okay. This is kind of important. Europe said okay because to some extent, Europe, was feeling pretty guilty about this. And they had some reason to feel guilty about how they reacted to World War I. The United States, however, has no guilt because they weren't a part of the Treaty of Versailles. They weren't a part of the reparations. They weren't getting money in response to this. They look at Germans' remilitarization with a completely different perspective, totally from this rule of law perspective. In 1936, FDR is still mostly focusing on New Deal programs, but he also begins to warn Europe that they need to do something about Germany. He gives a very famous speech in 1936 called the Quarantine Speech. And I'm going to mention this just a little bit because it's going to be more important towards the end of this unit. Quarantine, if you don't remember that term, is what you do with a sickness. If you think of a cholera outbreak, right? So this is a virus that spreads from person to person. So in order to prevent the spread, you quarantine the outbreak. So if there is a house that has a cholera, you put a sign on the door saying, cholera, do not go into this house. Anyone who's in there has to stay, they can't leave, no one can go in. It's quarantine. The idea is to stop the spread. Stop the spread of disease, and it's almost always used for disease. Well, in this case, FDR's quarantine speech is using the language of quarantine and applying it to Germany. And he's not talking about Germany like we don't like the Germans because we didn't like what they did in World War I. Because remember, the United States doesn't think that there's a winner or loser in World War I. Everybody is to blame. It's not Germany per se. What he's really talking about is that Germany and Italy, and at this point the Soviet Union and Japan, but mostly Germany is the biggest threat because they are the largest military power now. He is saying that they are becoming a threat because they represent rule by force, rule by might. And this is completely contrary to the rule of law. So just as cholera or some plague is contrary to the health of society, an ideology or a practice based off of force and military might is contrary to democracy. If you allow Germany to spread, then all of Europe is at risk of bursting into war. FDR is doing this in 1936. He is reacting to Germany's push into the Rhineland. He's reacting to Italy's push into North Africa. And he's reacting to a very old Japanese attack into China. And he's saying these countries represent a hostile ideology that is using military to solve the problems. This will beget war. Europe must adapt a more proactive stance. Quarantine. Quarantine is not the same as invade and declare war, nor is it the same as do nothing. There's somewhere in between. On that one option, if you do nothing, we could call this appeasement. Appeasement means don't say anything and maybe he'll get better. You see the example of appeasement. I use this all the time as an example. When you're in a grocery store and there's this little 5-year-old kid and he sees the candy right there in front of his face, and the mom is tired and she's got all the food there, and the kid says, I want the candy, and the mom says, no, you cannot have the candy. And immediately the kid starts making the biggest scene he possibly could, and the mom is now embarrassed because there's people in front of her. The mom really wants to swat that kid on the bottom, but she can't because there's people and they don't know what she thinks, and so she just wants them to shut up. So she'll say, shh, 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 just be quiet, just be quiet. And of course this tells the kid, I'm going to scream louder, I'm going to be more of a naughty boy. And then finally, in order to stop the kid, the mother might say, okay, just once, now, shh. That is an example of appeasing. You give in to stop the complaint, and instantly, that kid, as soon as he gets the candy, he's quiet. But of course, the next time you get into the shopping aisle, and the kid wants the candy, he knows all he has to do is scream, and the mom's going to give in. And the more that happens, the more the kid is being trained that if you scream, you'll get what you want. Doing nothing, appeasement, doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It just means that you avoid war. That's it. So that's an option, but FDR is saying doing nothing is actually going to increase a hostile ideology that will eventually lead to some type of conflict. You train that kid to complain every time he doesn't get what he wants. What if he decides to steal something? You have to put your foot down. Are you going to avoid the war? What if this kid decides to, do something violent to the mother? The mother has trained this kid that if they keep pushing it, they'll get whatever they want. The kid is too young to understand where that line is, that when you cross, it's too far. If you go too far, the mom will take you and take you outside. But you don't know where that is. So rather than avoiding conflict, you're actually making it more likely. And that is exactly what FDR's quarantine speech is warning about. The other option is just to go in and, when you see the kid doing something naughty, you just beat the kid. Well, you don't want to do that either, necessarily. You don't really want to be abusive so the kid never wants to say anything. And that's not what the United States is suggesting either. They're not telling Europe to go in and declare war on Europe. They're trying to Germany. They want somewhere in the middle, something in the middle. And in the middle is quarantine. And the quarantine basically says, don't let it spread. Germany can be Germany. Germany can go ahead and do military, but don't let it keep breaking the laws. If we said don't go into Rhineland, don't let it go into the Rhineland. Do everything you can to prevent it from going into the Rhineland. Prevent Italy from expanding. Keep it within the borders. This isn't a war. This is simply preventing expansion. It's somewhere in between doing nothing and fighting. I mention this because this concept of quarantine will become very, very important in 1947. I'll just leave it at that. I'll give you a hint. Berlin airlift. We'll talk about this after the war. I don't want you to be thinking about it now. I'm just thinking that this quarantine idea, 1936, is going to come up again after the war. Okay, so we go back to this timeline. 1936 becomes a turning point. Even though FDR is still mostly focused about domestic issues with the New Deals, he is becoming increasingly concerned about what's going on in Europe. The very next year, 37 and 38 are the big days. 38, Austria rearms. So that means that they become military. They were not allowed to do that either. And then more importantly, Germany and Austria join. This is the last of the really big rules that you're not supposed to violate. This was a major issue. Europe sent lots and lots of letters to Germany saying, you can't do this. And Hitler's response is, why can't we do this? The Austrians speak German. We speak German. We should have united back in 1871 when we united together. We should all have been one brotherhood. We're one fatherland. We should have done this. Why shouldn't we do this? And the West didn't have an answer. The United States, FDR was warning, this is what I meant about quarantine. You cannot let it spread. You let it spread, it gets to be too powerful. Now we're not talking just about Germany. We're talking about Germany and Austria. The country is now twice the size, and both sides are militarily increased, and we've got that whole territory next to France also increased. So now it's a much larger threat. This is a bigger risk that Europe could have done something about, but it didn't. Czechoslovakia becomes the last test. And I'm going to give you a picture of what Czechoslovakia kind of looks like. So this isn't a good picture, but here's Germany. Okay. And here is Austria. Okay. And Czechoslovakia is this kind of weird country that kind of goes like this. Okay. And this is obviously not the same. Hitler says, we are creating a new fatherland of German-speaking people. We're bringing a new empire. Not military, we haven't taken anything over, but we are restoring the dignity. Remember, when I came in 1933, Germany had no pride. It had no dignity. It was accepting the blame of all of World War I. By 1936, 3 years later, we have a military. By 1938, the German-speaking people are rising up again. Not to do anything harsh, but just to restore the fatherland. There are too many good people in this area to be crammed to a small spot of Germany. We need to increase to our natural barriers. Czechoslovakia has a portion in Austria called the Sudetenland. Sudetenland. And this is a territory that, if you look at it, it ought to be Austrian. It ought to be part of Germany. They speak German, they've got a German identity. We should take Sudetenland. Not because we're expanding, but because we're bringing all of our people back home. That is Hitler's argument. Europe says, no, you are expanding. You can't do this. That's like war. You're taking over. The Czechoslovakians did not want to be part of Austria. These guys have got weapons. This creates a massive conference where the people from England are meeting with the folks from Germany and Austria. And they're all going to talk about Czechoslovakia. And long discussions, long negotiations, and at the very end, the guy from England is a guy named Neville Chamberlain. And he will go down in history as the one who is most responsible for the appeasement of Hitler. Basically, he says at the end of this, we will save Europe from war. We'll save Europe from war because we're going to allow Hitler to take just the Sudetenland, because he promised he's not going to take anything else. He promised that that's all he wants. And so we are going to have the famous word, peace in our time. Now, the United States strongly opposed to this, but remember, the United States isn't part of the League of Nations. We're not actively involved in this, but FDR is warning, bad idea. Many of the people in England are warning, bad idea. On the other hand, nobody wants a World War II. And Hitler is saying, all I'm going to do is just bring the people back home. I'm not going any farther. That's it. So they had this agreement, peace in our time, where they will take the Sudetenland and no more. This is in 38. So we shift back here to our timeline. In 38, we have the Sudetenland.